Okay, good afternoon everybody and welcome to this panel session after lunch. I'm going to hand it straight over to Dr. Vanessa Douglas-Savage to introduce the panel, but there's opportunities for questions throughout and there'll be some key points. Also, if you wish to ask questions through the app, we'll try and include some of those as well. So if you can welcome the panel, that would be great.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for making it back after lunch. I have a theory that this is the worst time slot in any conference because everyone's just had some food, we've been outside, everyone's a bit tired. And this morning, I think Kay mischaracterised what we were going to talk about as being Troy Hunt, Wayne and a bunch of lawyers. But we are going to do better than that and we're going to be really interesting. So my name's Dr. Vanessa Douglas-Savage. I'm a director at a data and information consulting firm. And today I have the pleasure of chairing this panel on data security and liability in the age of data breach mandatory notification. Particularly interesting topic given the changes in Australia's privacy law as well as the GDPR coming into force. Now today we have 5 great panellists up here with me and they know lots of really interesting things. To set the stage though, I thought I'd quickly let you know how we're going to run today, how we'd like to run today, and what we're not going to do. So this isn't a panel where we're going to tell you about your obligations under the Australian Privacy Act. We're not going to tell you the basics of GDPR. What we're going to do is we're going to tell you some stories. And we want to tell you the really meaty, gritty stories, the really interesting ones that you can take back to your organisations and you can start having conversations about security with people who don't care about security. And so we're going to focus on 3 topics: planning for a crisis, responding to a crisis, and the really interesting one, I think, how you manage your suppliers and the broader ecosystem when it comes to data privacy and protection. So that's us for today. Get your questions ready. Nothing too weird and it is too weird or too varied for our panellists today. So without further ado, let me introduce our panellists for this afternoon. So directly to my right, we have John Moran. John is a partner at Clyde & Co, where part of his role is helping organisations respond to cyber incidents, alongside providing advice on privacy compliance, readiness and resilience exercises. Now, John, obviously your clients are fully prepared. Well, all of them, I'm sure. But to what extent do you think organisations are actually willfully ignorant of their obligations when it comes to privacy and data retention?
None of these questions have been prepped, by the way, so that was one of the rules of strict participation in this panel, that we actually don't know what we're going to be asked. It's a good question, and it's a question that crops up quite frequently. I think a lot has changed in the last 6 months. I don't know that the new regime was the catalyst for change that we thought it might have been, but I just think general regulatory scrutiny, what's going on globally, I think organisations are in a far better position than they were, but there are definitely some organisations that still have their head in the sand.
Thanks, John. The next one of our panellists is Kay Lamb-McLeod. Kay is an IT lawyer. She specialises in negotiating and drafting technology-centric contracts and advising on intellectual property and privacy matters. And she works with startups, IT contractors, as well as dealing with large-scale government procurement matters. So, Kay, here's your curly question. How do you see IT contracts changing in response to these obligations under data breach regulation?
To be honest, I haven't seen any change yet, but I'm sure it's coming.
Short and sweet, I like it. Next along, we have Troy Hunt, and Troy's an independent Australian InfoSec professional that I'm pretty sure most of you have heard of or followed at some stage in your careers. He's the creator of the data breach notification service, Have I Been Pawned? And you'll regularly find him in the press talking about security and sometimes even talking to the US Congress on the impact of data breaches. So Troy, your question: in a globalised world, is there a place for localised regimes?
Evidently, yes, because we've got the NDB scheme that's fundamentally different to GDPR. I would really like us to sort of say everyone's data is kind of equally important, as opposed to saying Aussie data is like this important and then the European data is that important. I'd love to see unification, but I guess global regimes being what they are, I'm not holding my breath for it.
Well, the One World Government is coming.
One world government.
Thanks, Troy. Next on the list, Nicole Murdoch. Nicole is a director of an intellectual property and information security practice group, Bennett and Philp Lawyers, an electrical engineer and the director of the Australian Information Security Association. Now, Nicole, you were the one that did get a little bit of prep ahead on this one. When are we going to see the first fine, the first really big fines under this regime?
I'm not expecting fines anytime soon. I think at the end of the day we're still in a honeymoon period. So I give it until maybe the first anniversary, the first birthday. And then after that I think the Commissioner will be looking at very gently issuing some fines at first, unless of course we see something that's just going to be obviously negligence or willful blindness.
Thanks, Nicole. And last but certainly not least, we've got Wayne Tufek. Wayne's a director at Cyber Risk, and for over 20 years he's been delivering pragmatic, business-driven strategies for cyber risk management in ASX-listed companies and some of Australia's largest organisations. So, Wayne, can a single privacy policy cover all the different privacy obligations that an organisation has?
It's a good question. Well, I don't see why not. Obviously, you need to go with the highest denominator. So a policy like GDPR, if you need to comply with that, obviously has more requirements than complying with something like the Privacy Act. So I don't see why not, yeah.
Sorry, we only have 2 microphones. Thanks so much, Wayne. So today's session, they're meant to be the teaser questions, and from here on in, we're open to anything that you'd like to know. We thought that we'd save anybody being the first person to put up their hand and ask a question by going to a question that's already been asked on the app. And have we got a good one lined up? Nothing. Oh, so come on, guys. Just because it's after lunch, we can do better than this.
So my observation about Australia's privacy laws are that they don't seem to apply equally across all organisations in the country, which would be a good start, I think. Do you think that's likely to happen? Like a state's, say for example, my organisation, the University of Queensland, isn't as exposed to the mandatory breach legislation as a private company in Australia. So is that kind of thing, do you think that will be likely to change?
I think that's a good lawyer question. Does someone want to answer that?
I've got quite a general answer to that, and I think I don't know if you're going to see wide-scale legislative change anytime soon in that space that brings it all together, but what we see when we're dealing with incidents is that while the notification regime is a consideration, we're seeing more and more organisations applying the 60 minutes test or the front page of the newspaper test or the best thing to do test, which is essentially saying, from a reputational perspective, we need to do this. And we value our customers, we respect the customers, and we want to get out ahead of any story. So I think that's probably going to be the biggest change you're going to see. There's the change in mind shift more generally. There may be a bit of unification at some point, but I wouldn't hold my breath.
So just thinking about how you start planning for a crisis, and I'm interested in the panel's view on this one. What do you think about the difference in the timeframe under the national scheme, which you have up to 30 days to notify, and GDPR, for example, where you've got a much tighter timeframe, around 72 hours? Troy, you look like you're desperate to say something there.
I just want to know what people are doing for a month, because, I guess this is a rhetorical question, right? But, even the 30 days, this is not, and a lawyer can tell me if I get anything wrong here, because you guys are very good at telling people that. It's going to go fine. So, yeah.
Troy, just remember.
Okay, so you've got 30 days, right, to disclose to the regulator, as opposed to necessarily having to go through all the steps of breach notification to every single person in there. So it's like almost like you got 30 days before you really have to do anything, which then goes out to the individuals. And I honestly just struggle to wonder what people are doing for all this time. So when we look at incidents like Equifax, and remember Equifax took something like 5 weeks after discovering the breach before disclosing publicly, and they got absolutely raked over the coals for it. I mean, that's what led to me going to the US and doing the Congress thing, because it became such a big issue that organisations were taking so long. And, you know, we've got GDPR saying you've got 3 days to report to your regulator, and we're like, nah, 10 times that'll be fine. Like, I just fundamentally do not understand why it's 10 times. And when we look at what we would consider to be sort of the gold standard of disclosure in Australia, it'd be something like the Red Cross. And the Red Cross in 2016 did 72 hours. I mean, even if we said a week, I could go, oh, okay, a week, maybe not so bad, but 30 days, I just have no idea why.
And in fact, it's not even 30 days, because there's some scope to, if you are going to take longer than 30 days, that there is some scope for doing so. So it's, if at all possible, within 30 days. So it's even worse than 10 times.
I attended a privacy conference last year, and the Privacy Commissioner was speaking, and he was pretty much asked that question, is why is it 30 days? Because a lot of us are pretty upset about that 30 days. And his response at the time was, it would be a very brave organisation to wait that length of time. But as humans, we learn through bitter experience, and I think that's exactly what we're about to experience. The organisations that know about it and are not proactive to do the investigation and simply drag their feet for the sake of the fact that they can under the Act, I don't think are going to be rewarded for those acts. I think they're going to learn very, very quickly. And we learnt through the very unfortunate but positive experience of the Red Cross that they handled that situation very, very well. They were on top of the PR, they were on top of the counselling, and they didn't end up with a fine. Given what was taken, they still didn't end up with a fine. And they reacted properly, and I think we learn from those experiences. And if we can take those lessons away, what does it matter what's in the legislation?
I'm going to be slightly controversial and say the 30 days, obviously an organisation, they should get there as soon as they can. They should get to that point of notifying. But we deal with a lot of incidents where there's false starts, where an organisation thinks something has occurred, it hasn't. They've sat on it with no ill will, or it's been reported internally and hasn't gone through the right chains. So I think the 30 days is a luxurious period. However, there are cases where you're 10 days in before they've sought any counsel internally or externally on what they should do. And that organisation may be operating in a land of unknowns for quite some period of time after that. They may not have the resources to deal with this. I think the point is that there's no one size fits all, but we're all striving to get out there in the first instance. But as I said, it is a solid period of time.
So what then do you think organisations should do in terms of planning? Because I think it's widely accepted everyone's going to be breached. At some point you're going to have a data breach of some scale. What are, say, the 2 or 3 things that an organisation can do now to actually get themselves ready? And who'd like to answer first? I think Wayne's got the other microphone, so...
Make sure that's working. I think it's important to have a plan, obviously, have that plan tested, make sure everyone in the organisation knows what their role is. The other thing I recommend is having 2 plans, one to handle the internal incident response and how you'll deal with that, and then another plan about how you're going to deal with external stakeholders such as your customers, the OAIC, and any of your service partners if you're part of a supply chain.
So one of the breaches I was involved in disclosing last year was Imager, the image sharing platform. And someone sent me their data. I verified it on Thanksgiving Day, and I reported it to them, and I ended up speaking to some C-suite exec eating his turkey, like literally the evening, that night of Thanksgiving. And they turned around notification in 24 hours. Incidentally, Discuss as well. Discuss had 18 million accounts compromised, including mine, 24 hours also. What I learned from Imager after they did the disclosure is that they had run exercises around breach disclosure the same way as they'd run exercises around disaster recovery. Yeah, so many of you have probably been involved in exercises before. It's like, oh, the data centre's just gone offline. You know, how do we roll over to data centre B? How do we fall back? Dry running that with data breaches as well, I think is a really good idea, and it made a very positive difference to them. And I dare say when we get to the point of having notifiable data breaches which could involve a penalty, the organisations that have prepared well for it, and the lawyers can probably comment on this as well, are probably going to be seen in a much happier light than those who just never did any planning. For sure.
I'd like to also add, although it may be something that we talk about later on, that when you have outsourced things to third parties, they may not be under the Privacy Act. This is in Australia. They might be under the $3 million threshold. So they may not have the same stringent requirements or the same practices that you have. It then becomes an exercise for larger enterprises, larger businesses that are under the Act, to also make sure that all of their arrangements with third parties require the third parties to either implement proper security and also to disclose it within certain timeframes to the entity.
I might just add as well that I think for those organisations that perhaps are not that far along in their journey into cyber awareness more generally, and if they're not at the point of having an incident response plan, or if they're not at a point of real engagement in an organisation, I try to advise organisations two simple things. First is have a discussion. Make that part of your mandate to have a discussion with somebody in the organisation about this. If you don't know anything about it, you speak to somebody who knows more than you. If you know a lot about it, you try to speak to somebody who perhaps doesn't know anything about it and should know that. And that also includes external advisors. So if you outsource your IT, you speak to that vendor. If you've got an insurance broker, speak to your insurance broker about cyber insurance. Just begin a dialogue, because I think that's the very start of every single journey. And then the second bit of advice we give in really practical terms is if you've got a contract with your IT service provider, print it and put it in a folder. That's the number one piece of advice, because when something goes wrong, that is the biggest hurdle for us in dealing with an incident. Understanding, as Kay has said, what the obligations are. What does that organisation have to do in terms of cooperating with you, allowing you access to the information, telling you if something has happened their side of the fence. If your systems are down, where is that document? So it's they're probably my two really simple pieces of advice.
Oh, thanks for that. We've got a couple of questions on the app that we might throw to, and one of them actually just relates to what you're talking about there, John. So we talked about having that dialogue with your suppliers and so forth, but what are the best practices that you should be looking for from them? Like, what should you be asking your suppliers to have in place so that they can help you respond to a data breach if necessary?
I'm going to pass that to Kay. Actually, we've just been chatting about that.
I see things that it varies on the riskiness of the contract and the size and value of the contract, but I see everything from just a general obligation that they disclose things and so on, or that the general obligation that they have reasonable IT security practices, all the way up to very specific, you must comply with ISO 127001, or you have to allow us to audit your systems from time to time and have them pen tested and give us the results of the pen testing and so on. So it does vary depending on whether you're a bank or whether you're a fish and chip shop.
I think, good question down there, Sasenka?
How do you see organizations like AusCert play a part in all of these, when a data breach does occur in situations?
Okay. So we mentioned the Red Cross before. When someone sent me the Red Cross's data, and this is just like some random person on Twitter, and it was kind of, some of you might have seen my talk here last year, actually. I showed the conversation. Some random guy pops up, says, oh, I've got a bunch of data. Thought you might like it. Oh, by the way, you're in there. Here's your date of birth and your name in it. Yeah, thanks, mate. That's great. When I first got that, I decided to send it to AusCert because to be honest, I didn't have enough confidence that the Red Cross, knowing nothing about them at the time, would actually deal with it responsibly. And I see so many companies that brush it under the carpet or try to avoid doing the right thing. Likewise, I could have gone to the AFP. AFP, they're trying to stop terrorists and pedophiles and things like this. Are they really going to deal with a data breach of that nature seriously? So, yeah, I went to AusCert not knowing precisely how it would pan out, but they are the ones who guided the Red Cross through the whole process. So I disclosed it, I think it was a Wednesday afternoon, no, Tuesday afternoon, And then first thing Wednesday morning, they had someone from Brisbane on a plane down to Melbourne. They spent the next couple of days down there helping all the communication. And by the end of the week, they had Shelley Parks, the CEO, on TV doing press releases and everything. So they made an absolutely fundamental difference to that communication. I don't know what it would have looked like without AusCert, but I don't think it would have been a shadow of how well it was handled.
From my point of view, AusCert's been particularly handy from clients. You might not realise it, but some people call the lawyer first. Well, they're in a state of panic and they want to know what to do. And we've been able to hook up a lot of clients now to AusCert, and I've never received a single complaint. And the best feedback we get is they came in, they knew what they were doing, and they weren't very expensive. So I've got full faith in them.
I'd just add that I think instant response in some instances, it can be overlooked. In that an organisation will have gone through a procurement process, they'll have put their policies, the procedures in place, and they'll have prepared an instant response roadmap, and that's the end of the journey. I think those instant response roadmaps are nothing if they're not tested, but also you need to have some sort of an instant response capability. I have never, in 150 incidents that we've dealt with in the last 18 months, I've never met an organisation, big or small, that isn't grateful for an external set of eyes, whatever that form looks like, whether it's AusCert, whether it's an IT security firm, whether it's a law firm, whatever that isn't grateful for just some external perspective on perhaps whether they are too far down the rabbit holes, whether they're chasing answers that they're never going to get and that they are off the track they need to be on in terms of notifying people or securing information. I think it's critical. I think external advisors are critical, but I would say that probably. So.
Thanks, guys. Have we got any other questions out there?
Yep, so I've got another couple from the app. One is there a gap between what management considers reasonable security at the moment compared to what the court's going to think is reasonable under APP 11?
That sounds like a lawyer question. Kay?
And my
I
question...
do not have a clear-cut answer to that because as we've discussed many times, a lot of the privacy principles are reasonableness. What's reasonable to you and what's reasonable to somebody else is going to be quite different, and the picture of what is reasonable may also evolve over time. So what may have been reasonable back when the Privacy Act came into operation for private enterprise, which was 2001, it's probably going to look quite different now. So it's difficult to say that there's one answer because it's what's reasonable.
And following on to that, leading from a question you had, or a statement you made earlier, how do you consider reasonability for eligible breach notification entities below the $3 million mark? So all the mandatory ones that aren't excluded by that turnover cap? And
so, are you saying that what's an eligible data breach for entities that are under 3 million?
No, what's considered reasonable controls and reasonable responses for those? Because there are entities that it doesn't matter what their turnover is, they're still mandatory or mandatorily required to actually notify. So health providers, for example, is the first one.
So that's right. So there are some smaller entities which are caught by. Which are an APP entity because of the type of data that they hold or their particular practices and what they do with the data. But they may be very, very small. So it may be a one-person outfit, but still called an APP entity. I think that the Privacy Commissioner has previously published some guidelines saying that they do take into consideration the resources of the entity in question. It's not as if they expect them to have the same gold standard as the Red Cross. Obviously, they're not the same size and they don't have the same resources. But again, what is reasonable?
And related, is it considered good advice for non-APP entities to still disclose, even if they're under the 3 million and aren't covered by the mandatory disclosure requirements?
That's a really big minefield because there is some... for myself, my personal take on it would be I think it's better to disclose than not, but that's because I'd like to see greater transparency in privacy across the board, regardless of size. But at the same time, I can understand why there are some entities which choose to hide things. I think ultimately it's not a good strategy for them because eventually it comes to light. In this day and age, it's getting harder and harder to hide the fact that you've had a security breach. At some point, somebody finds out, and when it comes to light, 3 years later, it's going to look especially bad for you. So I think that from reputational perspective and also just general managerial perspective, I think that it's better to disclose.
Just to add to that, I think it becomes a case of the tail wagging the dog in a lot of instances, in the sense that an investigation, at the beginning of an investigation, perhaps management may feel that this is something that can be controlled, or perhaps it's not something that needs to be disclosed, or it's not of a sufficient level to warrant disclosure. But more commonly than not, as an investigation progresses, the risks become more and more apparent, and those risks are operational risks, they're the risks that are posed to the data subjects, but more frequently than not, it's the reputational risk to that organisation, and I think that tends to be the key driver. Not to say that the rights of the data subjects are not paramount consideration, but reputational risk, I think, is a key factor.
So we touched a little bit on the PR side of things, and I think that's a really interesting breach, because I think as security professionals we tend to be quite well versed in controls and practices, but we don't necessarily have the best selling manner, if that makes sense. So how do you get the right people involved, and at what point in a data breach do you get them involved to help you, mitigate, retain that reputation that you've potentially spent a long time building?
I'll kick off. One of the key things that we advise organisations is having a consistent message, and that's not picking your story and sticking to it. That's not really what it's about. It's having your set of facts and building your campaign, your notification campaign to individuals, internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, regulators around the core set of facts, and that just makes it a more simple proposition for dealing with queries as they arise, for reporting internally to management. I think PR vendors definitely have a piece to play, but the advice we give to an organisation is your facts. Your facts are your key go-to. You understand your customers. You understand the language that your customers expect to hear from you. You understand how they want to be told information. And they should hear it from your voice. So while the PR vendor piece, as I say, it is important, and it's important to have legal advisors, it's important to have surrounded by advisors, I still think that an organisation itself needs to determine how and who should be told and when.
I think in terms of who needs to be involved in the data breach, data breaches can be quite complex. Was it something that the organisation actually identified through their internal systems? Or was it notification, as usually is the case, by third parties such as law enforcement or perhaps a security researcher? So who you need to get involved really depends on where you are in that continuum in terms of understanding how the breach occurred, how long were the attackers in your environment, what did they actually take, and that will drive the rest of the process in terms of understanding who you need to notify and do you need to notify. And what types of communications are going to occur outside of your organisations with your key stakeholders. So I don't think there's really one answer. It's one of those answers that says it depends on the circumstances.
There's so many answers that seem to end up with it depends. Let's try one that's a little bit more definitive. What's the most spectacular data breach failure that you've seen? We don't need details, we just want to know the fallout.
Where do we start? Like failed notification or failed communication?
Just the most spectacular of either of them, I think.
Look, I think in recent memory, Uber is sort of up there, here was a case where no matter which way you sugarcoat it, someone has broken in and stolen their things, and then they've gone, you know what, if we give you $100,000, it's a bug bounty. It's not a data breach. We won't have to disclose it. And you just kind of look at that and you go, look, I get it. This is what Uber does, right? It certainly is what they did do. under the old leadership. It was like, let's just push the boundaries everywhere and we'll get some penalties and stuff, but we'll get mindshare and everything and stuff will move on. And they've had to clean up a lot since then. But the very premise of trying to take something that I think most of us would be very supportive of, the concept of bug bounties, and take a legal activity which was there to exploit individuals and then sort of twist that around, I think that's probably the most sensational thing in recent memory that I can think of. Anyone else?
I think an example of a data breach that started off poorly but then got a little bit better was Target back in 2013. So Target actually were investigating the breach but didn't notify anyone, but the news story broke from Brian Krebs. So that's a lesson for all organisations, is the last person you want calling you or posting something on their blog is Brian Krebs.
Anyone else want to share a disaster story? So this is the problem when you have lawyers. They're all like, oh, we can't talk about some things.
I'll give you one slightly lawyer-related. I don't know if we've said this publicly before, but we will now. So the person who sent me the Red Cross blood service data breach only a few weeks later sent me Michael Page data. So this is Michael Page, global recruitment company. And when he sent me the data, he said, this is Michael Page. Michael Page is Capgemini. And I was sort of going, well, you know, what do you mean? Like, one's a recruitment company, another is a massive multinational outsourcing company. And what had happened is very similar to the Red Cross situation. So Red Cross's data was managed by a company called Precedent. Precedent exposed the data. Precedent, not a big company. Capgemini, one of the world's largest companies, they've got like 180,000 people they hired. Now, they had lost the data in a not dissimilar way. It looks like it was sitting on a development server somewhere. Now, unlike the Red Cross, where everything got wrapped up in 72 hours, nice and clean, clear communication, it took a very long time for Michael Page and Capgemini, between the two of them, to disclose what happened. And when I say a very long time, I mean not by Australian standards, it was like 11 days or something, but you know, by what we would reasonably expect, it was a long time. Under GDPR, they'd have a massive problem, I think. So it took about 11 days, and no offence to the lawyers here, but the reason that I heard from internal sources was they said there were a lot of people in suits sitting around trying to figure out how to spin it. And that just felt like really dirty to me, and I suspect to most of us. So some of you may have been in there. They operate in Australia as well. And I just don't like the assertion that our primary interest now is protecting the interests of the company as opposed to protecting the individuals. It's got to be a bit of both, but I don't think that sort of premise is a very healthy place to be.
Look, the people in suits were probably PR people, not lawyers.
So we've got an interesting question here via the app, and it is understanding the root cause of a data breach at all part of the regulator's remit? And do you need to understand the root cause before you notify? Anyone?
I think that's a really good question. Is it part of the remit? The answer tends to, our experience has been yes, because the regulator will want to know in the first instance who needs to be notified, how are you going to notify those people, what are they being told. But ultimately, as the investigation steps out, I think there is always a look-back exercise. There's very few that we've dealt with that I haven't experienced a look-back exercise. The Commissioner will focus, as Troy has said, focus on the individual. And then the second consideration is the organisation. How did this occur, and is there a risk of it happening again? And while I don't think it's written in as a feature of the scheme, but it is definitely a natural flow on from an investigation, and we've seen that in every regulatory jurisdiction that deals with these types of incidents.
So not to notify, but yes, as part of what they're going to ask you after the fact.
Well, they will ask. A lot of organisations, you tell straight up what's happened, because you're going to get asked sooner or later. That's the approach. You may not have the full picture on what has happened at that time, but if you've got a root cause, or if you've identified why it has occurred, for sure, we tell organisations to tell this, because you're going to be asked at some point. And the biggest risk with notification is that you're, as Troy said, you're trying to swerve something, or you're trying to structure it. It never works. It absolutely never works, and it's not something we recommend you do. If you can give an answer at that point in time, you give an answer. That's always the advice.
Well, one of the things just related to that, some of the recent incidents that I've been involved in disclosing, before they've made public disclosures, we've gotten someone from the press involved as well, who specialises in InfoSec reporting. So people like Zach Whitaker from ZDNet. So Zach has been involved speaking to companies like Discuss and Imager before their disclosure goes out. And the premise that I've put to the organisation is I said, look, it's much better that you control the messaging of the press before it's just like you with your basic sort of disclosure statements. Press picks it up, they put their own spin on it. Like, the press is going to grill you more than what you feel comfortable with, but you're better off having that discussion with someone who's going to be friendly to you because you're giving them a scoop, for want of a better term, than just letting people have their imaginations run wild later on.
Troy, do you think we'll get to the point where there's such notifications and stories are just so commonplace that it'll just be like, meh, here's another one?
So I started feeling, I think particularly around the time of the Uber incident, so this is about November last year, well, when we learned about the Uber incident, I started feeling that we were almost becoming a little bit desensitised to data breaches. And maybe some of you feel this as well, right? It's like, oh, every day there's another data breach, you know, something else has popped up. And I feel that we've moved from judging companies on the basis of whether they've had a data breach or not to judging them on the basis of how they've handled it. So I think most people have left the Red Cross incident with a relatively strong opinion of the organisation, as they have Discuss, as they have Imager. Equifax, not so much. Uber, also not so good. So I think, to be honest, this is a positive thing insofar as that will hopefully encourage organisations who've had a data breach to say, look, we know it happens to many companies. What's important now is that we are shone in a positive light in terms of the way we respond to it.
That's exactly what we tell organisations. This isn't strictly an IT risk at that point in time. It's an operational risk. It's how you respond, how you engage with your customers. And we've seen a lot of organisations that in fact come out of an incident like this and they've got greater brand recognition or greater support for their brand. That may not happen in the first instance, but an organisation, if they deal with it properly, they can bounce, and they can bounce quite well.
Also, don't go and have a data breach for the sake of brand recognition. Just adding that in there.
I don't think anyone in this room wants a data breach just for the option.
Hey, that worked really well, so let's do it again.
It does bring up an interesting question around governance, and so it's quite easy to think of data breaches occurring because of an IT failure, but more often than not, I suspect that there's a governance issue involved. How do you see that playing out in terms of both helping to identify and actually resolve some data breaches?
I think and I'm going by memory here, but of the Commissioner's report from the first quarter, so far, nearly half of the breaches have been through human error.
Humans are always the problem. If we could get rid of them, we'd be in such safer spot, wouldn't we?
Can I actually ask a question on that? What's a breach that happens not because someone made a mistake? Like when was the computer at fault? You know what I mean?
Russian hackers?
Russians are humans. What are you saying?
But they're not. But it wasn't an error. They did it on purpose.
Yeah, but are they not exploiting some other vulnerability in order for the data breach to happen? And that vulnerability was there because someone coded it incorrectly or configured it incorrectly?
I don't know if human error is at the cause of this breach, but if you've been following the recent settlement in the US for, is it Aetna, the organisation that paid $17 million in settlement to patients in a treatment clinic who were outed as being HIV positive because the envelope screen on the letters that were posted were 2 centimetres larger than the envelope screens that they had used the week before. And the purchase of those envelopes, we haven't got to the bottom of how that's occurred. But that is an error that is probably, even without, it could in fact be an automated error that has resulted in the incident, and a significant incident at that.
That's a really interesting example. Look, we've got 2 minutes left, and I thought what we'd do is just throw to the panel. If you can sum up in 5 words or less how you feel about mandatory data breach notification and how it's going to go in the future, what would those 5 words or less be? Wayne, do you want to start down that end rather than... We'll let you off the hook for a minute, John.
5 words or less. Mandatory data breach reporting, very good practice. It must happen.
It's a good first step.
Make it like GDPR.
Wait and see.
Get busy, talk about it.
And I'm going to sum up by saying it sounds like there's still a fair bit of work to be done. Thank you so much for your participation today. We've had a really great time. If you've got any other questions, feel free to come and ask one of the panellists or myself throughout the afternoon. And I hope you enjoy the rest of AusCert.